we good?
Yeah, looks
Awesome.
good. Looks good.
Great. So yeah, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about basically discovering the Filipino tech startup ecosystem for Digital Transformation Thursday. I hope this is going to be like sort of a fun talk for everyone, not too serious, but like just to give you a lay of the land, right? I'm going to first talk about Kubo and what it is. I'll also be walking you, the bulk of my talk is really like the 5 reasons we believe you should care about the Philippine tech startup space. And I guess I want to close out by also, in addition to doing like a Q&A with you guys, understand, like helping you understand how you can participate and be involved in the tech startup ecosystem. So, as introduced by Attorney JJ, I'm Kat Chan. And basically today I'm going to be your Sherpa, especially for the uninitiated to the tech startup landscape here in the Philippines. I'm actually also going to be joined by the cuties. So that's what we call ourselves. And some of the cuties are, have shared like a few vignettes and videos. And some of my teammates here will also be joining for the Q&A. So with that, so first I wanted to quickly introduce what Kubo is. So Kubo is, as you can see on the screen, it actually stands for the Bahay Kubo. So Silicon Valley has the garage where startups start. In the Philippines, parang medyo social na yung detached garage. So we decided to go with a Kubo. Primarily because it stands for humble beginnings. It's a physical home/space, right? But also this idea of bayanihan or teamwork really being the key to unlocking the potential of the Philippine startup ecosystem. And we were actually born out of bayanihan also, you could say. Like, so as JJ mentioned, we're a public-private initiative. We work with DOST and DTI that got us started, right, along with Idea Space and JP Morgan. And we work with startup, but stage agnostic means we work with startups like from their very early ideation stage all the way to like when they're grabbing like tens of millions of users and getting investments, right? And we also work with startups across sectors. And yeah, we work with a lot of partners. Genie has been one of our key partners from the start, as Attorney JJ mentioned, Lars, Paula, like their whole team has been helping out like a lot of our tech startups. And if you're one of those people thinking about getting into the tech startup space, you will find that having great lawyers is an amazing thing to have. And yeah, so our 3 core actions at Kubo are to grow, develop, and collaborate. And we have a few programs under each one. Basically, the grow bucket is, even talks like this, right? So we want to encourage as many people as possible to learn about startups, be interested and participate in this ecosystem. The second bucket is to develop the startups. So, we offer a ton of free programs and services for startups. So if you already have a startup, I hope you join us. It's, again, absolutely free. There's no catch. A lot of the programs have Q's in it because we like to misspell things that way. That's on purpose. And our final bucket is to collaborate with the ecosystem. So again, bayanihan being at the core of what we do. We publish a lot of reports. If you want like information about the startup ecosystem, I'll link to more of those later. But yeah. So, and we've been around since 2016. So it hasn't been that long, but in the last 4 years, we're already working with close to 500 startups now. We've deployed, we have a lot of programs. We even have one going on right now, like basics for business model or something. So, but essentially like, every week we have various programs, consultation sessions, including with the Genie, right? And a few other things. So anyway, if you have questions about Kubo, I think I'll stop this part here, but feel free to drop them in the chat and the Q&A, right? And we're happy to get in touch with you about that. So our vision is Filipino startups changing the world. I hope that in this talk, I'll convince you that there is a ton of potential for this to happen and that we're gonna do it by working together. So here we go. The 5 reasons why you should care about startups for non-startup people that are listening. So, okay, let's get started on that. But before we do, I guess, before I give you the reasons, maybe just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is a tech startup anyway? I guess one easy way to think about it or to explain it is to kind of contrast it with what it's not, which is a traditional SME, right? So a traditional SME would be something like, let's say, a restaurant, right? So you would say it's market proven, and like you usually prepare like a business plan. You know what to expect when you put up a restaurant, more or less. Versus a tech startup, like some of the key things that differentiate it are it's disruptive, meaning it's different from the way things are currently being done. There's potential for exponential growth, and things are pivoting and changing all the time. And I guess we usually like to show this graph. Like if you were gonna put up a new gym, right, or restaurant, you should expect that if you're doing everything right, like if your food is good and the service decent and it's not COVID, right, that people would always you should be linearly growing, right? Like you should be making money from day one somehow. And more or less you know what to expect and can plan for it. With startups, the key thing that makes a startup, I guess, is that it is sort of a project or an experiment a lot of the time, right? And what comes with that usually is, if nobody knows what you're up to or have heard of what this concept even is, like it's super normal for startups to be, kind of failing and not making money in the beginning, right? But the idea is if you are onto something that's different and innovative and people love it, you cross a certain threshold where you have this potential for kind of exponential growth, right? Where in principle, maybe you don't have competitors, or you have an opportunity to, change the way people do things. And that's sort of what you've seen with a startup like Grab, right? So again, maybe even just 10 years ago, if I had told my mom or dad that I was gonna, take a ride with someone that I didn't know, right, and let him or her take me to some destination, that would have been crazy, like inconceivable. But that's something that we do every day now, and it's tech and startups that kind of allow these new types of models to happen. So I hope we're all on the same page on what startups are, at least for the purpose of this talk. There is a legal definition. I won't go into that, but yeah. So reason number one, I guess in case you haven't heard, tech startups are super huge, and I guess you should care about them because just so you don't FOMO, like no fear of missing out, right? So of course, you've probably, like all of these logos on the screen, these are the sort of massive tech giants from Silicon Valley, right? You also have some of these names that are, more Asia-based or emerging market-based, but all of these tech companies, right? Like they were all once startups. Like they were all created by, one or two founders. These aren't sort of inherited companies that have existed for hundreds of years, right? Like, and yet today they dominate the landscape, right? So again, just looking back 10 years ago, there was one tech company in the world's largest market cap companies, right? Now today, 7 of those 10 are all tech companies or tech startups, once startups, right? So it's inevitable in terms of how it's changing our world. And this is it's important to kind of know about it. In Southeast Asia alone, the tech startup world has already exceeded $100 billion in value, and that's only expected to grow. Like it's still on that upward trajectory. It's nowhere near flattening out. And this is creating real value in the economy, right? So Gojek is kind of like the sort of Angkas/Grab of Indonesia. In a couple of years ago, it contributed $3 billion to Indonesia's economy, like millions of jobs already created there, right, by this one company. So, and I guess there are already 9 Asian unicorns. I think this has actually grown, but essentially, every year we're adding to this list of, a unicorn is $1 billion company, right? So, and every year, like the region is adding more of these. So yes, it's important. And I guess you might have heard about this like industry 4.0 thing, right? So it's a fundamental change in, or paradigm shifts that have come in every, once a generation, right? And they say we're currently in the 4th industrial revolution or some, I think that's the term. And again, our belief is that these companies are being created today. I mean, some of them already exist and some of them are just being created, right? And these aren't going to be inherited companies. So that's reason number one. It's huge. Don't be FOMO. But I guess the second reason that you should care about startups is because startups are already here. So this isn't just a phenomenon that's sort of abstractly happening in Silicon Valley or in China. The Philippines has a ton of tech startup activity and it's growing every day. So I think a lot of everyone that's watching, we're all zooming here in this for this talk, right? We're consuming like a lot of tech products now, and some of the sectors on the screen are the biggest. I mean, travel and tourism was a big one that's been sort of hit hard by COVID, right? But in most of these other things, like, e-commerce is definitely blown up, and fintech also, right? And sort of reaching the unbanked and alternative payments. So this is all very much part of our current reality. But I guess what you might not know is that the Philippines is also creating a lot of startups, right? So we're not just consuming technology, but we're also making it here. And there are a few reasons why, investors and the world are pretty excited about the Filipino tech startup ecosystem. Of course, the sort of demographic dividends, the fact there are like lots of young people, like a super fast growing middle class, like English speaking, right? Means that we do have a lot of tech talent and also a natural market to use that tech, right? And users are the fuel of any kind of tech business. So that's definitely something that the Philippines has going for it. We also have pretty low, costs and barriers to entry relative to a lot of countries of a similar sort of size and kind of power, right? And I like to say it's more fun in the Philippines. So that's why it's also more fun to start a startup in the Philippines, I'd like to think. But it is still quite a young startup ecosystem. Currently, we're estimating between 700 to 1,000 active tech companies operating here in the Philippines. We have a relatively small number of investors and VCs, but this number is growing. There's a lot more support going on even before, especially before COVID, but even now, right? And, the government and our schools are also taking an active interest in nurturing the tech startup space as, another path to growth. It's been termed an accelerating ecosystem. So it's in that bucket. The year-on-year growth has been, fantastic. We're in the region, like, only behind Singapore and Jakarta, about the same Jakarta in terms of the growth rates. So some of these highlights are from the Startup Genome Report, which compares, the startup ecosystems of, over 100 countries. And yeah, and there are some areas where the Philippines is actually like ranks really well. Bang for buck is one. I'll discuss more on that later, right? The talent is relatively inexpensive, so it allows people to kind of build things quickly and, cost efficiently. And there's certain subsectors where we do really well too, like media and fintech. So, and, like we increased by 17 places, from the last 3 years, according to some rankings. And this is also supported by, increases in our global innovation index and a few other things. So yeah, let me introduce Ross. So Ross is one of the cuties at Kubo, and he's gonna talk a bit about, how he's actually one of the first employees, I guess, at Kubo. So I asked him to share a little bit about his experience and how the Philippine startup ecosystem has changed. So let me pause for a bit and play this video for you guys.
Hey everyone, so I'm supposed to talk about the startup ecosystem and how it has grown since the start of Kubo. And if I remember correctly, when we started back in 2016, we actually didn't have a lot of initiatives or a lot of investments for startups back then. No? So during that time, there were some programs or initiatives or activities for startups, but they were very segmented. And I guess what we did in Kubo was really to have a consistent flow of programs and initiatives for startups, also including like different networking events, connecting startups to investors, and even a lot of like workshops, consultations, feedback sessions with mentors for startups. No? And with that, I think the past 3 years, there has been a lot of growth when it comes to startups in the country. So there are more startups in the Philippines nowadays, and they're actually a bit more active than before. So they are better connected. So through different networking events, not just by Kubo but even all the other enablers in the country, the startups get to meet with each other, get to meet with different partners and investors, and with those connections, there are more of them working together nowadays compared to before, back in 2016 and even before that. There's also more investments that have been happening in the past few years. So actually, before 2016, there's no clear way for an investor to meet with a startup. No, so usually it's through word of mouth, and with the different connections. That's how they usually meet with startups. No, but with us in Kubo, what we tried to do was better organize how startups are connected to investors. So we do have a lot of different showcases, events, where we connect investors and match them with startups that we feel like would be relevant in their portfolio. And with that, we've actually had like a few startups that got investments from our network of investors. No, but aside from what we do in Kubo, because of like a more vibrant startup ecosystem in the country, more and more investors from Southeast Asia and even outside Southeast Asia are looking to Philippine startups and are curious to see how they can potentially be part of it. They know that there's a lot of potential with regards to Philippine startups and for them expanding to Southeast Asia. So a lot of them were actually more open to investing in the local startups compared to the local investors before. No, yeah. So that's the general landscape. More and more VCs and investors from, let's say, Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries are looking into the Philippines to see how they can invest in a local startup and potentially help them expand to the other Southeast Asian neighbors. No.
So that was Ross. And yeah, so Ross is our senior program lead for ecosystem development. He works with a lot of our partners. So if you're interested in sort of partnering with tech startups and you're not a startup, I guess like he's the guy to speak to. But yeah. I also wanted to mention that this startup movement, I guess, or the growth in startups isn't just happening in Manila. There are a lot more initiatives, especially by the government, right, to make a lot of resources for startups available to other places, both physically through the technology based incubator network, but also through a lot of online resources that they're deploying now during COVID. Um, so yeah, it's happening everywhere. Like we're not immune to the startup bug, the virus also, and it's a really exciting time to be part of the startup ecosystem. Actually, even with COVID notwithstanding, I guess. And we're even seeing like a lot of local governments adopt startups and start working with startups in various facets of our lives. So I know like Senti, one of the startups that we've incubated at Kubo, actually was a speaker at one of the previous digital transformation Thursdays. And the city of Manila, for example, is working with him, a startup, right, in how to use AI for analyzing complaints. I read an article this morning that I think Intramuros has like the second fastest internet speed in the Philippines or something. So I don't know if platforms like this have helped inform some of those good choices. But anyway, it's happening everywhere, and it's touching different parts of our lives even now. So the second person I wanted to introduce from our ecosystem development team is Dave. Dave's actually here in person, but he also shared some remarks over video. And Dave's awesome because he's also worked at incubators, in Danao. He's done a ton of work like, being active as a community organizer in the startup ecosystem. And I asked him to share a little bit about what he's seeing in terms of sort of grassroots startup development around the country. So here's Dave.
Hi guys, my name is Dave Del Rosario. I'm from Kubo Innovation Hub, and today I'd like to share with you how the Philippines is rising and making waves in the global startup scene. Way back 2005 to 2010 maybe, there are only few startup founders, few enablers and champions in the industry, and heck, we don't even know what startup is all about. If you're a startup founder during that time, you really have to hustle all day and all night just to get your product out in the market. You also have to attend every startup activities and events happening in the city, just so you can find your partners, your co-founders, and future investors that would help you build your product or your startup. In short, life was hard for startup founders during that time. But fast forward now, it's still hard, never became easy. But the whole community is behind you now. And when I say whole community, as in both the private and the public sector, supporting every Filipino startup founders in the country. And I think I'd like to mention the three agencies who have been really supportive in terms of strengthening the Philippine startup ecosystem. Our deepest gratitude, of course, to DOST, to DTI and DICT. Because of their collaboration, we now have so many supports, programs, initiatives that would definitely help the startup founders in our country. One of which is the TBI program of the USD. Through this program, we now have 30 plus active technology business incubators in the country. From Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. No, one doesn't need to go to Manila to get proper support because wherever you are, there is a technology business incubator in your city. Name it, Bulacan, Baguio, Batangas, or Nueva Ecija, or Tigagaraw. Cebu, Iloilo, Bacolod, or Dumaguete, Iligan, Cagayan de Oro, Davao, Bukidnon, and Butuan. There is an incubator eager to support and incubate you as you build your startup. Through this program, we're also preparing and cultivating the academic sector, especially the students, to become an entrepreneur. We are introducing them that entrepreneurship is life. Lots of theses and researches are being realized and commercialized because of this project. And most of all, we want them to be innovative and problem solver in the community. We want them to build a startup. We want them to solve pressing problems through technology. Also, as a community builder myself, I'm so happy to see different programs and events happening in the countryside, most especially startup weekends in different places outside Manila, startup competitions and conferences in different universities and colleges, different inuman and kapihan sessions of different community leaders and enablers in their region to talk about how to support their local ecosystem. And of course, there are different LGUs are allocating budget to support startup initiatives in their town, and many more. Indeed, the Philippine startup ecosystem is progressing. Let's also not forget as well as the Innovative Startup Act, which was signed into law last 2019. It's called Innovative Startup Act, or the RA 1137, which aims to strengthen, promote, and develop an innovative and entrepreneurial ecosystem and culture in the Philippines. Of course, this is because of the tripartite agreement of the DICT, DOST, and DTI. And it's composed of different programs, benefits, and incentives for startups and startup enablers through the Philippine Startup Development Program. This includes access to funding and grants, business registration support, grants for training, research and developments, and expansion projects, startup visas, tax breaks, and support the participation of startups in international events. So there, everyone listening right now, today is actually the perfect time to build your startup. With all of the supports and programs that we have, all we need to do is to unleash that burning idea, gather your close friends in a garage, and talk about business and make it happen. So it's now or never. Good luck to everyone.
Yeah, so that's Dave. here with us today. So if you have any questions around, the community of startups in Manila and even outside, like, throw us a question in the chat or Q&A, and he's also here to take them live later on. Hey, Dave. So just to recap, startups are huge everywhere. They're here in the Philippines, and the third reason you should care about startups is because they're probably literally making your lives easier right now, or they can be. And especially in this sort of COVID disrupted world, startups and tech and a lot of these things are, when you talk about digital transformation, it's happening right before our eyes, right? So in this part, I'm just going to talk to you about some of the startups that have been kind of rocking it, right? But actually, I've also asked another cutie, so Britt, who's also here, to share a bit about like some of what she's seeing in terms of how startups are making our lives easier in various ways. So turning it over to Britt.
Hi everyone, I'm Brittany, a program associate for the startup community at Kubo. And here at Kubo, we define startups as providing innovative solutions to problems. So if you can remember back when you were a kid, your parents would tell you not to talk to strangers or get in their cars. But through Grab or Angkas, that's exactly what we do to get from point A to point B. And who would have thought of that as a solution to a transportation problem? Other examples are if you ever used GCash to pay for bills or send money to someone, or bought something from Shopee or Lazada because of the monthly sales, you'll have experienced firsthand how startups have made your life easier. Now you can do banking and shopping, things that you used to go out and line up for, online and in the safety and comfort of your own home, which is especially important because we're going through a pandemic and we have quarantines in place that prevent us from going out to avoid infection. So you can see that startups, especially now during COVID, have played a role in making everyone's lives more convenient in different things. There are startups that help you earn extra income or contribute to a cause, while like Kumu, where you can live stream to help frontliners through fundraisers. And we have startups like Zoom that help you with your online classes or work, and startups like Taxumo that have made the confusing process of filing for your taxes easier and more understandable. Aside from making your life easier as a consumer, we have startups that also help businesses like Last Mile that helps small restaurants by partnering with them and providing logistic services so that restaurants can still serve customers. So all in all, you can see how these startups have risen to the challenge and have come up with solutions and services to help people through COVID. And to showcase these startups, we've actually, last July, held a competition called Rescue to recognize and help these startups that have responded with ingenuity and flexibility during these times. And a few startups that were part of this were FH Moms that help give a platform to moms to earn extra income, and CU Doc, which gave you access to doctors so that you can consult with them even from your own home. So yeah, you can see startups are redefining and making life more convenient and easier for everyone despite COVID, and will continue to do so even after the pandemic. What once was a task that took too many steps to complete can be done in a few clicks or taps. So if you have the next big idea that can help many people, why not turn it into a startup?
So yeah, that was Britt. She's in our startup community team. We actually have a lot of ongoing, workshops, programs, even incubation, right? And she's also on the call here today. So thanks, Britt. And, again, happy to take any questions and stuff like that in the chat. But yeah, just to kind of recap some of the things that Britt mentioned, startups are enabling a digital life. And I think that all of the kind of box logos are very familiar to everyone. And, you're probably using some of them now in your own kind of smartphones and things. But in addition to helping consumers and everyday people, right? Like there are also a lot of, I mean, around half of the startups in the Philippines are also actually in B2B, meaning they cater to businesses, right? And it's actually quite interesting because of the Philippines, kind of history with providing kind of back office solutions and services, right? That we've also evolved like a very robust ecosystem of startups that are working on services for other businesses, right? Including the back end services, so for that enable, for example, e-commerce and merchants. Like Paymongo lets a lot of online sellers take in credit card payments, for example. Mosaic like is has a really strong footprint in the F&B space, right? And sort of tracking not only inventory and POS and all of these things. So OneWat's a really interesting sort of Filipino innovation that actually has more applications. So they have these sensors that listen to, like, if you're a car enthusiast and you can just hear it and that may problem yung car. Like in their case, they're using AI to listen to motors in factories, right? Industrial motors. And it allows them to kind of preemptively kind of diagnose if there's going to be a problem with the motor or it's not operating super efficiently. So, again, and all of these things are being built by Filipino engineers, Filipino talent, right? So super promising stuff there. And, speaking directly to the COVID-19, the challenges of COVID-19, I also wanted to point out a few startups, maybe not in the, obvious spaces, the giant ones that I showed in the previous slide, right? So, we have startups, for example, in the medical space, like, right? So in addition to the e-commerce ones that are kind of helping shuttle around tests and PPE, we also have this company called Aid. So they are allowing you to do like lab work, like, I think even vet services, like patient visits and things like that, through a few taps on the phone, right? Of course, we also have telemedicine ones like See You Doc and a few others. I think payments is again a huge space, like, not just like access to traditional banking services, but like alternative things, right? So you're looking at guys like NextPay, right? Suki Plus like does sort of financing for sari-sari stores. So even at that sort of micro level, right? We have startups there. I think e-learning is another huge area where, there's so many challenges now because of COVID, right? Like Front Learners has these kits, like these school kits where you can get really high quality, like, educational materials, and you don't even need an internet connection. And they're deploying these in, like remote places that, currently probably wouldn't be able to have school otherwise. We have Esco Labs. So they're like a company that's basically training like data scientists. So you guys can take a course. They're, through a small grant we gave them, they're able to give out free courses now that for, I guess there are different tiers of data science, right? So, at least the very early sort of encoding and kind of that sort of stuff. So, and even EduSuite, right? So EduSuite's a B2B one where they basically help with things like school enrollment, and they also use AI to kind of figure out like the load scheduling and things like that. So in a lot of spaces I could go on and on about like the interesting things that our local startups are doing, but they are building stuff and they're very active now. Like you can even say that perhaps like tech startups is one of the few industries that, isn't crashing because of COVID, I guess. Or it's definitely created an opportunity for startups to kind of see where the problems are and address those gaps. And then of course, I don't want to forget the essential services, right? So everything from groceries to kind of fixing the agriculture supply chain to getting mechanics to, and people to repair your things, like your appliances that you sorely need right now, right? So like I know there are a lot of logos on this slide, but there are also just as many startups that are building really like awesome solutions, quite frankly, to a lot of today's issues. And so I guess the next time you know, get a house cleaning appointment or get food delivered, you know, think about the, you know, I hope you patronize one of our local startups, right, that are building these things. They're doing really, really cool stuff. They probably don't have the same advertising budget as, you know, Grab does, right? But it's really worth giving some of these companies a try, and hopefully they'll make your life and your business a little bit easier in these times. So yeah, that's it for reason number 3. Reason number 4 that I think you guys should care about startups is, you know, like there's this whole kind of mythology, or I guess ethos, around the culture of tech startups, and there are probably a few things that you can pick up from it, whether or not you are running a tech startup, right? So there are a few life and work lessons from the startup playbook. And, you know, and I guess things to think about here are, you know, again, how startups can, you know, thinking like a startup could affect your company culture or even you as an individual, right? So I've again co-opted some of my teammates to kind of introduce this concept. And so now we have Carla and Danny from our startup community team who will talk a little bit about how startups are disrupting culture and why startups are, you know, different in that sense. So yeah, I'll let them take from here.
Thanks, Kat, for including us in the talk. And thank you for the Genie for featuring Kubo in Digital Transformation Thursday. I'm Carla. I'm also part of the Kubo team. We're part of the startup community group. And with me is...
Hi, everyone. My name is Danny, and I'm the program associate for the startup community at Kubo.
I think do you need tissue here?
Oh, thanks, Carla. I actually do.
All right. So I wanted to add a few points to what Kat has covered in startups figuring out their own way of doing a fresh take on company values and company dynamics now. And a few examples have been given, but we also observe some of these things in the local startup context. And one point on that is that startup teams usually give high regard for individual contribution, and it's really contribution and output driven more than time and tenure driven. And we've talked to a few founders when they're building their team or putting their team together, and they usually look for people who can contribute concretely versus your resume and how long you've been in an industry, or even how long you are willing to put into a company. It's really what you can contribute concretely to get to where the company wants to go, or to contribute to the company's success. And this gives an open playing field between newcomers or newer players in the tech field, and that gives them more opportunity to work alongside and hand in hand with industry experts that have a longer experience in the community. Now, that's an open stage for all to be working together in a new project. Next is being a lean company and being open to change, being flexible. Usually, the startups that we work with, they don't focus on one track of progress just because they are still figuring out their way along the business, and they don't really know where one meeting can bring them, one pitch session can bring them, and what their validation experiments will bring them. So what they're working on now might not be what they're working on the next month or the next quarter. And so all the startup founders in the startup team are always prepared to change, as long as they're working towards a bigger goal or a bigger vision to provide that solution. And aligned to that, my third point really is the alignment in vision. And it takes a special group of people to commit their time and their skills to you and to your vision and to the potential of a business, especially if it's as risky as they're not assured salary or benefits in the next few months. So that's something special in startups, in that all the people that are working on an idea believes in the potential and works towards that common vision of the startup and the company. And so Danny also has a few things to add to startups changing culture.
Okay, so as what Carla mentioned, startup culture, it's not just for techies, it's actually for everyone. So everyone can learn a thing or two by adopting the startup mindset. So the startup mindset, basically, it really does encourage you to be innovative and to push for progress. So having worked with several different people in the startup community, so Carla and I have worked with startup founders and community builders as well, and we've noticed that there are similarities in how they work. So these people are, well, they're risk takers, they're bold, and they love learning. So we've actually heard some startups mention that they're lifelong learners. So they create a sort of culture that really champions entrepreneurs and supports the whole startup community. You can apply the startup mode in any size of company. So whether you're a small company, you're a big company, or you're an entrepreneur, or you're from the private sector, the mindset of a startup or the startup culture can actually really help you succeed and create a difference. So mentioning with that, actually, since the mindset is for everyone, then you can tell that everybody actually does have a role in the community. So every entity in the startup community has a important role to play. So everyone really collaborates with everyone else in the community to create a to get something positive back from each other. So entrepreneurs and startup founders are actually the heart of the whole startup community. So of course, they're the whole reason why this community exists. For startups, being able to join the startup community can actually contribute to the success that they have. And communities really do help entrepreneurs create opportunities in many ways for the startup founders and the startups too. And then organizations such as accelerators, incubators, venture capitals, universities, the government, these are all organizations that play a key part in the community because they help bring together all of these startups. They create programs that support these entrepreneurs and startup founders. And if you're actually not from any of these organizations, so for example, if you're a person who just wants to explore, you're a non-techie person, you can still play a role in the startup community. So for example, you're a lawyer, or you're a person who has expertise in agriculture, then you can act as a mentor for these startups. Or if you're an accountant, you can also provide accounting services for these startups. So as well as for example, you're actually just you're a customer of one of the startups, and you can actually provide them with crucial feedback that they need for their startup. So again, whatever background you come from, you can still have a key role to play in the startup community. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's quite a lot that Carla and I talked about. Carla, do you feel like you need a drink?
I think I do.
Some coffee with you.
Thank you. And so I think with that, we'd like to say we hope that you join this community. We want to see more of you, hopefully using these products, joining us in some of the events. And if you just want to learn more, Kubo is always open to help you and to help you get into this space and this community. So again, I'm Carla, and with me is...
I'm Danny.
And that's... for the startup community team. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
So that was Carla and Danny. Thanks, Carla and Danny, um, for sharing that. So I guess to quickly recap some of the points, right?
Thanks, Kat, for including us in the talk.
Okay. So yeah, so just to recap, right? Like what makes startup culture different? Well, I guess the first thing they mentioned is startups are famous for being sort of quick to adapt to changes. And I think that's a mindset that we all really need to have now, right? Like we can't predict what's going on. We can't build the 5-year business plan, right? So with startups, like they pivot, they switch things up like as the moment needs it, right? Or as the problems evolve. And I have two quick stories about that. So on the left, it's a bit cut off, but basically like there's this founder, her name's Abby. She's not particularly a techie, but she's really into fashion. And they used to deliver style boxes, like every month you'll get your clothes picked out for you if you're a guy that's too lazy to come up with your own outfits, right? Or you just want something new. So they had this company called Genie. And basically like when COVID hit, right, like they were able to kind of translate that expertise in supply chain, right? And now they're like delivering grocery boxes and meal boxes and other essential stuff. So same genies, right? But from style to commodities. And then another very similar story, right, is Mad Travel. So as the name implies, right, it's a voluntourism startup, right? And their core mission as a social enterprise was really to help out communities, create like a really good livelihood, right, by bringing in tourists to a lot of these places. But then obviously the demand for that dropped out overnight, right? But of course they were sorry, they wanted to stay true to that mission of being able to help out the communities. So what they did was actually get like a lot of these products that were being made in the communities. So like honey, like really good like organic vegetables and things like that. And they would they would package them, they would do good designs, and now they're like delivering them to various places. So they're still achieving that mission, they're still kind of keeping their company going, right? But now it's a completely different model, but that doesn't stop them from creating an impact, right? So this is a great mindset for people to have, especially now, right? And it's something that I hope we think about as we do startups, right? And I guess again, as I mentioned earlier, startups is probably one of the few industries where there's still some hope slash growth, especially in some of these sectors that I mentioned earlier, right? So at least a fifth of our startups, when we did the survey with PwC, reported that COVID's in a way actually positively impacting their businesses. Like people are more willing to give things a try in some areas, right? Or have been forced to. But I think the really interesting number is this sort of 49%, like at least half of the startups, and this was in the beginning of the pandemic. I think we did the survey like in April, said that they were already, even at that time, like offering a new product or service. So this mindset of being able to quickly pivot or try something new, right? It's not easy, of course, to do this, but just something we might be able to learn from our tech companies. And I guess a few quotes, right? But on the screen right now. But I talked about the first one, right? Embracing the pivot, the shift, right? And I guess having that culture of being okay with failing. In the startup world, we say it's not a failure, it's a pivot, right? So you're constantly experimenting. You don't expect that you'll get it right the first time, but it's that process of experimentation that's really important. It's about risk taking, of course, smart risk taking and listening to your customers, but being willing to try something new and to test it out, right, is also really important. And that one is from Jeff Bezos, richest guy in the world, right? there's also this sort of dreaming big, right? Like having audacity and like kind of thinking bigger, instead of, like instead of having one restaurant or one store, how can I kind of scale this up so that I have 50,000 restaurants, right? Airbnb was probably the classic example of this. Like they never built a single building, but they were the world's largest hotel chain, right? So thinking about how an idea can be scalable at the get-go is really important. And at the same time, also being lean and skinny. So I think the common feature with all startups is they all start somewhere, right? And typically they don't start with a big office and hiring, hundreds, thousands of employees. Like it's really an idea, it's your sweat, it's your testing things out and then scaling that out, right? And sometimes that does involve doing things that don't scale in the beginning, but yeah, it's pretty important. And I guess in terms of working for a startup, of course, they're like, I think, the tech industry pays really well now, and it's kind of the Wall Street or the consulting of 20 years ago. But I guess my message here is, if you're a parent, let's say, and your kid wants to get into work at a startup, it's not necessarily a bad thing. They didn't fail in life and waste their university degrees, right? Working for startups can be really cool. I hear this a lot, like, starting a startup or working for a startup is, the equivalent of getting an MBA, right? Like you get exposed to a lot of different roles at the very, even, especially at the early stages. You kind of, you learn like a lot of leadership skills, and it's also a really fun community to be a part of. It's not super glamorous. You don't get like the nap pods and things like that in most local startups that there are to work for, but it is great exposure. And it's something that you can learn from, right? Like, and that you can bring with you in other aspects of your life. So, keep an open mind to it. It's really cool. And I guess one other thing I wanted to address when talking about startup culture, right, is that there's this perception that, you're like, like startup founders all look like Mark Zuckerberg or something, right? Or Jack Ma, like it's like some solo guy in a hoodie. But most startups actually aren't like that. Actually, I can't even really say what most startups, quote unquote, look like. We have, we have startup founders that are, married couples with kids, like, retirees. I guess the majority, I'd still say, they tend to be younger. I guess it's easier to take risks at that point in your life. But another important one is that there are lots of women founders out there also. Kubo has a Startup in I program. This is my favorite program, I think, that we have. So I just wanted to kind of give it a special shout out. But I guess my point really is that there's a diversity of people, right, that participate in the startup ecosystem, and as Danny mentioned earlier, play different roles. So, like you should be able to see yourself in this community, in this ecosystem, and it is a very welcoming one. So, and like having exposure to different types of ideas and different problems is actually what makes for a really good founder. Like it's very rare that you have a founder that abstractly solves a problem, right, that they don't understand. Usually, we in the Philippines, for example, are probably in the best position to solve problems around things that we experience ourselves. So yeah, so if you are suffering from some kind of pain point right now, then you can also probably be part of the solution in trying to fix it. So yeah, everyone is welcome to the startup community. I hope you guys again join Kubo. It's free. Even if you're not a startup, there's room for you. Attorney JJ and the rest of the Genie team are all official cuties already. So yeah, so that's reason number 4. And the last reason I'm going to talk about today, because I guess is the investment opportunity. So you can make money from startups, not just from starting a startup yourself, and being a billionaire, hopefully, but also by investing in one. Although I will kind of preface this by saying, please don't bet the farm. Like startups are inherently risky by definition. So if you do decide to invest in a startup, then that is very much wanted. It should be money that you're willing to, like it's okay if you don't make it back, but there's also a chance that, you know, make a lot. And in 2019, so it's a bit, you know, the current data is a bit, you know, difficult to track down, right? But I have a few stories from 2019 just to show you guys that it has been picking up, right? You know, coins.ph, one of the earlier, you know, startup companies, was acquired by Gojek for 72 million US dollars. That's one of the larger acquisitions of, you know, local tech companies. Kumu, one of our incubatees, they actually closed like another round after this already in 2020. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they do like, I mean, it's too Gen Z even for me, but it's like, you know, some combination of like e-commerce and games and like all sorts of fun stuff all through live streaming. And, you know, they've gotten both traditional and startup investors on board, right? So they're working with guys now like ABS-CBN and like the Gokongwei Group and things like that. So, and yeah, I like recently they were like the #1, you know, app downloaded in the Filipino app store. Like they're beating like Facebook and Google and all of these like giant apps, right? And this is Filipino made. So something that we're really, really proud of. I mentioned PayMongo earlier, like again, credit card payments, business is exploding, right? And they've also gotten some funding. We've got things in e-commerce, great deals, right? They're behind a lot of the things that you can buy even in the big app stores. Like it's not a household name brand, but a lot of the things that you're buying there actually go through things like great deals, right? Multisys also got like a you know $2 billion 2 billion peso investment from PLDT. Yeah, so like again, and MedCheck, right? So this is so they're doing like pretty cool stuff around, you know, using AI for clinical trial information and things like that. So they were able to raise money too. So it is picking up, like, so, and obviously if you were an early investor in any of these companies, you would have made a pretty hefty return. You know, nothing you could see like in your time deposit or even in blue chip stocks in the PSE, right? So super interesting stuff. But again, I need to kind of say this frequently. 9 out of 10 startups fail. So most startup ideas will fail. Like, I mean, hopefully they would have failed, you know, before they, you know, too much money was lost. Like there are some epic fails that you might have heard about, like WeWork, right? But generally, like, you know, but yeah, so while there is a huge opportunity to make a return on startups, you know, like again, if they hit that inflection point, you know, they're unstoppable, but a lot of them do die in the valley of death thing, right? Like that. So yeah, so please be mindful of that. But yeah, and I guess we could do a whole talk on the tech startup equity financing cycle. I'll quickly go through it, right? I mean, I think for most people here, like, you know, you would be the FNF, the friends and family, right? So again, support your pamangkin or your kid with a dream of starting something. You usually don't need a lot of money just to get started, right? It's here where the kind of serious investor money comes in, and there's a whole kind of cycle to that. But as I've been mentioning, right, this valley of death is very real. But the whole point of, you know, funding tech startups is, again, they don't, to be able to properly experiment or try something completely new out, you do need a bit of money to get started. If you're looking at a space that's very competitive, right? You know, like if you're competing against like a Facebook or a Lazada or something like that, right? Like they usually have raised a ton of money. But yeah, I will save this for another talk. Unless you're really interested in this, in which case I can take some questions about it. But essentially, I do want to say that, you know, in the same way that there's no cookie cutter startup founder, there's also no cookie cutter investor. Like you can invest in a tech startup, but again, plug lawyers or your friend, like do get good advice. Like, you know, I mean, Kubo is also here, right, to kind of help you navigate the space. But most startups don't need that much money to get started. And, you know, it is an interesting way to, you know, invest what, you know, extra capital you might have, right, into something that's meaningful and growing and, taking part in this ecosystem in that way. I mean, a majority of startups actually, start through, if not personal funds, family funds, right, or their friends, grants, and these kinds of other non-traditional sources. But I guess one thing is, startups prefer to tap investors. Like, I guess you could think of it as like, it's really nearly impossible for startups to get a loan from a bank or something like that, right? Like in the beginning, what you have is maybe like a cool idea and like a few lines of code, or a prototype of something. So yeah, so startups will typically prefer kind of equity structured deals versus getting into debt. And I guess I want to give one example of this. So this company is called Quickwire. They were, they've pivoted a few times actually, but the idea was cross-border billing and payments, and then they focused on now like sort of property payments and things like that, right? And remittances from abroad. They've had so the photo below is like this. I mean, this photo makes them look really fancy, but they're nice people. Like it's the Manila Angels Investors Network. So an angel investor is, basically a person investing their own money into tech startups. Like again, you could be one if you'd like. And the thing with working with angel invest, so now Quickwire has actually grown quite a bit from those early times when they were raising their seed funds and their angel funds. So they've recently closed like an institutional Series A round. And they've grown a lot, but like there was a really big inflection point when they got like this angel money, right? And I guess angel investors don't just usually give money. They also provide other strategic value. So when this small company, right, at the time, like they were just like 5-6 people, needed to raise another round. Like they even had like some of the angel investors, they even had someone sit in as like the CFO for the company and help them like get their stuff sorted out. They gave a lot of good advice, helped the company with connections, right? So if you do decide to start investing in startup companies, like it's an interesting way to have that type of relationship with founders, right? But the expectation is also that it's not just money you're giving, but like there are other things that sort of come along with it. And yeah, like by angel investing, you're investing in, maybe some of the things that are going to revolutionize how we live, right? You get in on the ground floor and some really interesting ideas. You get to be part of their growth story. And there are different startups for different people, like, depending on what interests you. Like, maybe taxes and reg tech is really like, what gets you excited, right? But we also have startups in, in agriculture, like Cropitals, helping a lot of smallholder farmers access like fair interest loans. Education is, again, I mean, I think that's obvious from their name, but it's also a really cool startup, right? Jazzy Pay is like helping people pay their hospital bills and tuition fees and things like that, right? So you can find a startup that aligns with your own interests, your own and your own kind of passions and things that you believe in. And I guess, it's also a great time to invest because it's relatively cheap to invest. I mean, there's some pretty positive sort of reports coming out that it's going to be a great place to invest in post-COVID. It's relatively inexpensive to start a startup here in the Philippines, so it doesn't take as much money to get things going meaningfully. I think, in the world, right, I think we're developers here are relatively inexpensive also for their quality. And as I've been talking about throughout this talk, right, like with great disruption comes great opportunity. And so like the whole sharing economy, right, like came about from the 2008 financial crisis. So like that's when, like, I don't know, Airbnb and Airbnb and Stripe and Uber and all those guys were born in that era. Google and Amazon and all of these guys were born in the kind of previous crisis before that. So, it seems like Zoom is probably going to be the rock star of this pandemic, right? Like, but I'm absolutely certain, like, we don't know what the kind of post-COVID fallout is going to be yet, but there are going to be like some huge success stories that are gonna come out of this particular point in time when we look back on it. And it's again relatively affordable, I guess, to be able to invest. So, give it a chance. It's not a crazy idea, right? But again, don't put your life savings all into startups, but do consider it as an alternative, place to put some fuel behind some of our companies. And I guess there are other ways to work with startups also. Like I like this visualization of like a Swiss Army knife, right? So investing is just one thing to do, right? But again, there are like lots of events, even support services, programs you could look at, but different ways to kind of interact with startups depending on what your objectives are. But there is a place for you. So yeah, so I guess that's it for the first part, actually. Like, so just to recap, top 5 reasons to care about startups, and I hope I've convinced even one person here to sort of take another look at it. One, it's inevitable world FOMO, right? Startups are taking over every conceivable industry, and we're seeing this happen around the world. So, do pay attention. Number 2, the Philippines is becoming a startup hotspot. Like there are so many interesting big companies going on and like sprouting up like everywhere, right? And there are different ways to be able to interact with these companies. The third is that startups are probably making your life, or could make your life or your business better through their different innovative products and solutions. The fourth is, I think there are some things we can learn from the startup mindset and the startup culture. And last but not the least, right? Like it might even make you some money, like to make some of these bets and create impact with your money. So, these are some unique opportunities to interact with and care about startups. And we're really excited to be in the middle of this space as Kubo, and we hope to kind of have some of you be part of that. So yeah, that's